The following content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not constitute means for diagnosis, healthcare advice, nor treatment. Make use of a qualified healthcare professional for such purposes.
My name is Charlene Ortiz, and today I will be presenting my doctoral study, dissertation oral defense, for the research titled The Impacts of Religious Discrimination Towards Anxiety in Diverse Populations. Next slide, please. I would like to extend my gratitude to my chair, Dr. Reba Glidewell, my second member, Dr. Arcella J. Trimble, my UOR, Dr. Maggie Martin, and the program director, Dr. Timothy Lionetti. Next slide, please. Chapter 1, Background. The topic description revolves around religious discrimination, which refers to the harassment, retaliation, and adverse treatment based on the religious and non-religious affiliation of the individual. Discrimination complaints based on religion have increased more in recent decades when compared to other forms of discrimination. The need for the study is evidenced by how Muslims and other non-Muslim groups demonstrate higher levels of anxiety when their beliefs are a cause of discrimination. Studies that attempt to approach discrimination do not directly acknowledge that based on religion. Next slide, please. The research literature scope includes past research. Abrahamic values, for instance, particularly those of Christian beliefs, were noted as a diagnostic criterion for mental health disorders. Anxiety arises due to the acculturative stress some Muslim Americans might experience. Non-theists and secularists are considered to be the least capable individuals for presidential candidates when compared to other persons of any gender, sexual, or racial minorities, and convicted sex offenders. Women who adhere to specific dress codes, such as Muslim women and fundamentalists, have been identified as particularly vulnerable based on religious discrimination. Racial and ethnic discrimination have also been linked to anxiety, thus suggesting a potential reasonable justification for addressing moderation towards religious discrimination. Next slide, please. The gap in the literature, well, first, very limited information has been obtained from religious minorities and clinical constructs in the United States. Scholars suggest that religious discrimination remains an understudied topic and needs to be addressed through empirical research. This lack of studies about religious discrimination with populations other than Muslims results in the gap currently present in literature. This study could be used to address this understudied topic, thus providing potential positive social change. Next slide, please. The research problem is based on the impacts in diverse groups, which includes depression, isolation from individuals that do not hold similar religious views, and the adverse impact to self-esteem, which could lead to increased anxiety. Not addressing this empirical literature gap could result in a disservice of treatment of other non-Muslim groups who could be experiencing religious discrimination and its detrimental effects on anxiety. Next slide, please. The problem's significance in the field is that practitioners have limited resources, data, and techniques specifically catered to religiously diverse clients experiencing anxiety due to religious discrimination. Religious minorities such as non-Christian theists and non-theists are exposed to discrimination. Despite these findings, the impact of religious discrimination and anxiety is yet to be studied with other non-Muslim groups in the United States. Next slide, please. The purpose of this quantitative research was to compare the differences between the proposed religious preference groups, which was the IV, and the moderating effects of sex, race, and national origin, or the moderating variables, and their influence on anxiety, which was the dependent variable. The overall expectation is to make use of this research to bring awareness to these subclinically significant issues experienced by diverse communities, to include religious and non-religious groups, and to expand the theoretical framework proposed in this study. Next slide, please. I would like to point out that the null hypothesis for all research questions was that there is no statistically significant difference between all the groups, and the alternate hypothesis for all of them is that there is a statistically significant difference between non-Christian and Christian groups, as well as the rest of the groups. Having said that, the first research question is, are there any differences in Christian, non-Christian, and non-Christian theist and groups and anxiety? The second research question would be, do sex differences of males and females of each group contribute to anxiety differences amongst religious preference groups? Next slide, please. The third research question is, do racial differences of Caucasian and non-Caucasian participants contribute to anxiety differences amongst religious preference groups? Next slide, please. The last research question is, do national origin differences between non-foreign and foreign-born participants contribute to anxiety differences amongst religious preference groups? Next slide, please. The theoretical framework of this study was composed of two separate theories. The first theory was the intergroup anxiety theory, which was proposed by Stephan and Stephan in 1985. And it proposes that negative or anxiety responses originate in the lack of information that is based on limited contact amongst groups. The second framework used was the integrated threat theory. This theory proposes that people could engage in these discriminatory and prejudicial behaviors due to fearing the consequences of perceived threats. Both theories have been used to understand diverse groups and the in-group, out-group anxiety dynamics. Next slide, please. The nature of this study was a quantitative, non-experimental approach with a non-probabilistic sample of some racial minorities, but a representative sample of Christian, non-Christian theists, and non-theists. The sample consisted of an independent convenience non-randomized sample, where religious preference was the independent variable and anxiety was the dependent variable. Sex, race, and national origin were the moderating variables for this study. A one-way analysis of variance was used to conduct a mean comparison. There are multiple sources of data and analysis, which included religious and secular community partners. Initially, participant pools were proposed as data resources. However, that was not the case for the final study. I also made use of a demographic questionnaire and the scores of the outgroup contact measure and the Beck anxiety inventory. Next slide, please. The definitions for this study include religious preference, which is both religious and irreligious demographics, such as individuals who currently hold a Christian, non-Christian theistic, or non-theistic self-identification. The second term for this study was the non-Christian theist. This includes all other non-Christians. These individuals' beliefs are included within a religious doctrine, distinct literature, the ordination of ministers, and frequent adherence to a place of worship, amongst others. The non-theist are all other individuals who do not prescribe to either a Christian or non-Christian theistic belief. This includes atheists, agnostics, secular humanists, and unaffiliated individuals. Next slide, please. Religious preference discrimination refers to the perceived treatment from persons of the outgroup based on a distinct characteristic, that sets each group apart. In this case, religious preference. Anxiety, this term refers to the distress of persons from the in-group and which status is believed to have been caused discrimination stemming from the outgroup. Next slide, please. Since the researcher cannot assign group inclusion randomly, given that the groups were already in existence, each was evaluated through a non-manipulated independent variable or their categories. Given that the groups were developed in a natural setting, the researcher would have to assume that the variances come from the independent variable. The rationale for this assumption is that they are necessary as they stem from the characteristics of a non-experimental design where the groups or independent variables are already set and occurring prior to the comparison. Next slide, please. The limitations for this study. First, the lack of random assignment undoubtedly results in apparent limitations. Some threats were present on both the internal and external validity, and these will be discussed in further detail and presented in Chapter 4. The data interpretation here was exerted with caution as a contingency measure to address these weaknesses. Next slide, please. The scope and the limitations include the internal validity. Here, I conducted one based on stratification, based primarily on religious preference, later sex, and the automoderating variables as means to provide a specific focus to the study. There is evidence that supports the claim that these characteristics, such as race, sex, and national origin, might contribute significantly to anxiety. Therefore, it is fittingly necessary to include these factors when considering anxiety and diverse populations. For the external validity, during the proposal stage, it was initially thought that the sample of certain religious denominations, such as Muslims, Buddhists, Jews, and other participants, was not going to be a representative sample of the general population, but luckily this was not the case for the final study. Next slide, please. The significance of the study, it will be its original contribution by informing anxiety literature and clinical practice. Secondly, it will be to provide groundwork by expanding and developing current research of understudied religious groups. The significance to theory could be expanded by providing a wider understanding of potential interactions amongst overall multicultural status discrimination and anxiety. This expansion could help in explaining how discrimination relates to mental health and further psychological distress and concerns. Next slide, please. The significance to practice is that these research efforts could relate to positive social change through the incorporation of multicultural dynamics and its genuine and significant value towards the desired empowerment of underrepresented groups. The significance of social change is to provide the foundation for the development of support networks as means to mitigate potential mental health problems within disadvantaged, minority, and diverse groups. Next slide, please. Chapter 2, Literature Review. The literature search strategy was conducted through Walden University and its multiple databases as well as Google Scholar. I also made use of databases from the University of Puerto Rico and Mayagüez. The terms for the literature search strategy included religious discrimination for the independent variable, sex for the first moderating variable, race for the second moderating variable, national origin for the last moderating variable, and anxiety for the dependent variable, along with its synonyms. I did include seminal works in this study as means to provide a historical scope of the progression of the literature regarding religious discrimination and anxiety. I only made use of peer-reviewed literature, and I also included quantitative and qualitative approaches. However, no dissertations were included. Next slide, please. The previous approaches and weaknesses. The initial studies about discrimination defined this problem as merely disliking persons from the outgroup. Researchers have approached this problem by examining both Muslim immigrants and Muslim local nationals. Methodological inadequacies included few studies investigating moderating and regression effects towards discrimination and small sample sizes. The vast majority of the literature focusing on religion and discrimination is primarily founded on studying Muslim individuals. Race-based discrimination and its potential psychological implications have been covered to a much lesser extent with other racial groups, such as Caucasian, Hispanic, and Asian populations. Next slide, please. The variable selection justification is that the irreligious are the most marginalized group regarding religious discrimination preferences. It is necessary to evaluate other variables that might moderate anxiety based on religious preference, as proposed by Peterman in 2014. Discrimination against women of monastic ranks is seen as culturally permissible in certain denominations and societies. Gender differences could account for how interactions amongst intergroup dynamics contribute to anxiety and intergroup threats. National origin discrimination is potentially based on the perceived threats against the host country's ideology, physical security, and negative stereotypes of the immigrant outgroup. Next slide, please. Controversial and mixed findings include that religious adherence, can yield both a negative and positive correlation with anxiety. Racial identity has yielded outcomes of both seeing racial discrimination at a greater and a lesser rate. Women belonging to racial minorities are exposed to more racial discrimination, but report lesser distress than men. Despite the fact that foreign-born persons could be subject to discrimination based on nationality and religious preferences, religious adherence provides other benefits to psychological well-being. Next slide, please. The summary and conclusions for this literature review. First, religious discrimination might also be prevalent amongst non-Muslims, such as Christian theists, Jews, Buddhists, atheists, and other religious and irreligious preferences. Discrimination was founded on expected threats of security, their way of life, and negative stereotypes from both the in and out groups. Multicultural factors like sex, race, and national origin showed a similar theme as potential sources of discrimination and anxiety. Despite that, religious preference and other diverse factors could contribute to perceived discrimination and anxiety. Each variable was also a source of coping with adverse psychological effects. Next slide, please. Chapter 3 includes that presentation of the research design and its justification. The research design that was selected to answer these research questions was non-experimental. Research questions were aimed towards a quantitative approach, which were catered to examining potential differences between groups provided by the independent variable and the dependent variable. The lack of manipulation of the independent variable is an agreement with a non-experimental design. Normalize is sample, which means that these groups were not selected or assigned from or by any random groups. The non-experimental design choice is consistent with research designs needed to advance knowledge in the discipline, as other studies have yet to examine the moderator effects of multicultural variables in religious preference and anxiety. Next slide, please. The target population in this study was individuals who hold either a Christian, non-Christian theistic, or non-theistic belief or disbelief. Sex and racial minorities, along with foreign-born participants, had the main emphasis of the study provided discrimination impacts. The minimum aggregated responses that was needed for this study was 128 from non-clinical English-speaking adult participants. Next slide, please. This study made use of an online recruitment sample strategy. The research questions presented here called for a highly diverse group of both religious and irreligious persons. No regional or international limiters of current place of residence were set. Only English speakers participated in this study. It must be noted that participants were not expected to come from vulnerable populations. Next slide, please. The recruitment process included community partners of Christian church temples and non-Christian Christian houses of worship, and religious and secular-based social online forums. They were contacted via email, and they were provided with a letter of cooperation. I also made use of public domain email announcements and flyers, and I did not make use of any online participant pools. The participation and data collection. First, the participants were provided a link to the informed consent via automatic screen prompt. They conducted a self-report demographic questionnaire. Here, I made use of the outgroup contact measure scores and the Beck anxiety imagery scores, I should say. Participants were able to exit the study at any time by leaving the survey site, and there were no follow-up procedures in this study. Next slide, please. The outgroup contact measure was created by Schmidt and Associates in 2009. The scale was focused on the establishment of a measure that could note the in-group and out-group relationship between religious and irreligious persons. The scores are interpreted via a 7-point scale. Participants might select a range of scores where 0 signifies that they have had no interaction with religious outgroup, and to a score of 6, meaning that they've had more interactions with the religious outgroup. It includes a Likert scale, which ranges from 0 to 6, with an aggregated range of 0 to 24. This instrument is available for research without written permission. Next slide, please. The Beck Anxiety Inventory was developed by Beck, Epstein, Brown, and Steer. The instrument was aimed and created a discriminatory measure between cinematic areas of anxiety and depression. The scores are calculated based on 21 items, where the examinee responds to the severity of symptoms as experienced within the last 4 weeks. The meaning of the score is based on a 4-point scale, which is a Likert scale that ranges from 0 to 3, with an aggregated range of 0 to 63. It has a T-score of 50 with a standard deviation of 10, and likewise, this inventory is also available for research without written permission. Next slide, please. The data cleaning and screening procedures worked with the program of SPSS. These included tending to outliers and other factors that might have impacted the assumptions. The statistical test included a 95% confidence interval, and I also made use to the SPSS's process add-in, which was used to conduct a multiple regression analysis to test the moderating effects of sex, race, and the religious preference anxiety relationship. The significance value of P was used to determine the degree of variability of the independent variable and the moderating variable towards the dependent variable. Next slide, please. The threats to validity included, based on the internal validity, included statistical regression or outliers, which were eliminated during the data cleanup procedures. The external validity, initially, some threats were eliminated since this is a non-experimental, non-treatment, no intervention, post-test only, static group comparison design. As such, no threats were expected, since the purpose was to gather a representative sample as means to generalize the results. Regarding construct validity, the theoretical framework and instrument alignment was present, therefore no threats were expected. Next slide, please. The ethical concerns of this study included the community partners' influence towards a religious congregation. No adverse effects were expected during participation. Participants had emergency mental health resource contacts available, and all of the data remained anonymous. Next slide, please. Chapter 4, or data collection. As means to comply with federal and local laws and the institutional policies, the IRB's permission was requested and was later granted on July 6 of 2017. I submitted a letter for flyer distribution and announcement request, I should say, to community partners from which potential participants could be drawn, invited, and recruited to the study. The survey was also made available via public domain, online email announcements, post, and flyer placement. After the data cleanup procedures for outliers, 31 persons refusing to participate, 424 responses were kept. 10 responses were eliminated to establish group equivalency. Therefore, the resulting final number of participants for this study was 414, or 82.30% response rate. Regarding discrepancies in the data collection, neither the university's participant pool nor Qualtrics' participant pool were used. Consequently, only participants with access to the community partners, the public domain, online email social forum, and announcements, and flyers in the community locations had access to the survey link. Next slide, please. The baseline descriptive and demographic characteristics. First, the independent variable of religion was divided into three levels, I should say. The first level was Christian theist, with a total of 130 persons. These included evangelical fundamentalist Protestant, mainstream Protestant, Catholic, and other Christian beliefs. The second level was non-Christian theist, with a total of 142 participants, with a Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, and Hindu belief. The last level of the independent variable was non-theist, which included unaffiliated secularist, agnostic, and atheist groups, with a total of 142. The first moderating variable of sex was divided in three levels, listed as male and female participants, as well as non-binary, gender fluid. The majority of the participants were male. The second moderating variable, or race, was divided into 6 levels that included white, Black, or African American, Hispanic, Latina, Latino, Asian, Middle Eastern, and 2 or more races. The majority of the participants identify themselves as white, followed by Hispanic or Latina, Latino. Next slide, please. The third moderating variable of national origin was divided into two levels of 337 non-foreign born participants and 77 born participants based on the host country. Most participants had a national origin background of European countries, followed by Asian, African, and Middle Eastern countries, and Latin American countries and territories. Persons from a national origin of 44 countries participated in this study. Next slide, please. Prior to the analysis, some assumptions, such as tending to outliers and appropriate sample sizes needed for a regression analysis, were addressed during the data cleanup procedures. A probability plot helped to illustrate how this assumption was met, as well as other assumptions. Additionally, a quantile plot showed a linear relationship of the model's variables, thus satisfactorily complying with that assumption. However, it must be noted that the Levine-Cephes test of equality of variance showed that the assumption of homogeneity of variance was not met. Therefore, the hypothesis assuming that the variance amongst group was equal had to be kept. Consequently, the subsequent data analysis was interpreted with caution, given the potentiality of type 1 error. Next slide, please. For the first research question, Figure 1 illustrates the evidence to support that there is a statistically significant difference in the anxiety levels amongst religious preference groups. Religious preference showed a significant impact and a large relationship with anxiety. Further, Tukey's test showed that atheists and agnostics differ significantly, at an alpha of less than 0.05. Figure 2 illustrates that participants that identified as Muslim had a significant OCM score. The Hindus reported the second highest score, where evangelical fundamentalist participants reported the least willingness for religious outgroup contact. As such, the null hypothesis was rejected for research question number 1. Next slide, please. Table 1 shows that Christian, non-Christian theists, and non-theist participants rated their responses based on the perception of the severity that each symptom had over the span of the last 30 days. When compared to both scales within the inventory, somatic subjective versus panic-related symptoms, the sample reported less severe responses regarding somatic symptoms. However, only persons who believe in a deity, both Christians and non-Christian theists, reported severe anxiety somatic symptoms. On the other hand, persons that identified as irreligious, the non-theists, reported the majority of the severe panic-related cognitive anxiety symptoms. The most severely rated symptom for Christians was indigestion. For non-Christian theists was the feeling hot symptom, and for non-theists was the inability to relax. In general, Christians reported the least amount of severe responses for both the somatic and panic-related cognitive anxiety symptoms, followed by non-Christian theists and non-theists. Next slide, please. For the second research question, Figure 3 illustrates that there is a statistically significant difference in the anxiety levels between males and females. Sex showed a significant impact and a median positive relationship with anxiety. Further, Tukey's test showed that male and female groups differ significantly at an alpha of less than 0.05. As such, the null hypothesis was rejected for research question number 2. Next slide, please. Regarding the last two moderating variables, race showed a non-significant impact towards anxiety. As such, the null hypothesis was retained, since there was no statistically significant difference in anxiety levels amongst different racial groups. For the last research question, national origin showed a non-significant impact towards anxiety. A medium positive significant relationship was found with race. As such, the null hypothesis was retained, given the lack of statistically significant results supporting the differences in anxiety levels provided national origin status. Next slide, please. Chapter 5, or the interpretation of findings. Scholars have previously noted that the practices associated with belonging to a religious group assist in mitigating the anxiety effects. Arguably, agnostics do not necessarily have religious group belonging that other religious preferences might inherently foster. As a result, the benefits of anxiety symptom reduction coming from the religious group membership and perceived community support are non-existent for this population. Consequently, the lack of group membership might provide a rationale for this study's particular finding regarding increased anxiety symptoms amongst agnostics. The religious group membership of other persons could also explain the agnostics' heightened levels of anxiety. The higher levels of anxiety that agnostics presented, in this study could be understood by the IAT's outgroup expectations. Within the scope, agnostics could be experiencing anxiety given the negative expectations of disapproval that could be stemming from the outgroup of other religious preferences. The negative expectations or stereotypes of the irreligious could be explained by the IATs as a source of anxiety for agnostics. These findings, provided evidence that Muslims were the individuals with the most outgroup contact. Previous empirical literature provides support that this demographic has experienced religiously based discrimination due to perceived threats that this group might pose towards the religious outgroup. However, this study expands previous research since it suggests a disposition from Muslims to engage in outgroup contact with other religious groups. The implications of the OCM results with Muslim participants are twofold. First, this Muslim religious demographic is aware of the ongoing discrimination stemming from non-Muslims. Secondly, Muslims might be becoming more inclined to mix with persons from other religious preferences via community contact as means to mitigate perceived threats and discrimination. This interpretation also corroborates suggestions from Croucher in 2013 that the exposure through outgroup contact might lead to cultural awareness and discrimination reduction. Next slide, please. On the contrary, evangelical fundamentalist Christians reported the least willingness towards religious outgroup contact. This finding could imply an inclination from the evangelical fundamentalist Christians to not engage with persons from the religious outgroup as to not put their in-group beliefs in jeopardy. This rationale is consistent with the propositions suggested by veteran colleagues in 2016, where members of a group might consider that such exposure could incur in a threat to their values and their in-group way of life. The moderating variable of sex proved to be a significant factor in the relationship between religious preference and anxiety. In the literature, there were mixed findings concerning whether sex could be either a coping or contributing variable towards anxiety. This present study's finding corroborates previous research in which sex was noted as a potential variability factor towards anxiety as stemming from the gender-based discrimination. Therefore, sex did not present itself as a potential coping mechanism, towards anxiety, but rather a moderating factor of distress, as suggested by Nadal and Associates in 2015. Non-Christian theist females reported the highest anxiety score out of all religious groups and sexes. This finding could validate that Japers and co-authors in 2012, where non-Christian females could be often exposed to religiously based discrimination and later subsequent anxiety. Next slide, please. For the last moderating variables of race and national origin, it must be noted once again that these analyses yielded non-significant results. The lack of null hypothesis rejection could be associated with one of the previous literature mixed findings contentions. Previous research noted that racial identity could be used as a possible source in mitigating discrimination and accordingly experience anxiety. Similarly, national origin identity was also proposed in some literature as a buffer for diverse groups. In this case, foreign-born persons could make use of their home culture's religious practices as means to cope with discrimination behaviors coming from the host country. Next slide, please. When it comes to the shortcomings, an internal validity limitation was that participant bias was present regarding the measurement of the dependent variable of anxiety. The test of homogeneity of variances showed that the ability to answer some of the research questions could have been impacted. Mainly, these issues concern the statistical regression threats with the variable of anxiety. The majority of the scores obtained were in the upper third quartile of the BAI, never reaching a maximum score. As a result, it could be argued that participant bias regarding the expected outcome of the study might have led to a low, non-statistically significant result for some respondents. This examination awareness could be an inherent limitation found in self-report measures. An external validity concern is the racial makeup of this sample. Only 2.7 reported being Black or African American, despite 13.3% of the population identifying as such in the United States. Next slide, please. Researchers that feel compelled to expand this study's efforts could address the mixed literature findings reviewed in Chapter 2 and the external validity limitations reviewed in the present chapter. The literature review provided mixed support about whether in-group identity could result in a means to cope or exacerbate how discrimination was perceived. Therefore, including group membership scales could provide evidence of other factors that might have moderated, non-significant results. Likewise, this study provided support that evangelical fundamentalist Christians were the least likely to engage in religious outgroup contact, which corresponded with the literature's concept of intergroup threats. As such, subsequent research could include scales that examine religiosity as a potential moderator of anxiety. Lastly, this study had a non-representative sample of Black and African American participants. However, a vast amount of the literature supports that this population experiences race-based discrimination that could later impact how distress is experienced. Other researchers are encouraged to replicate this study to include a larger number of Black and African American participants. Next slide, please. The implications of this study, regarding individual impacts is that despite religion being commonly associated with the broader and greater scope of culture, differences within the individual's religion or irreligious beliefs or disbeliefs play a role in the cinematic expression of somatic and panic-related factors of anxiety, and hence subsequent anxiety. Regarding the methodological, theoretical, and empirical impacts, this study's contributions at the research level included 3 specific literature contributions. These were done via addressing previous methodological inadequacies, theoretical expansion, and empirical findings. Lastly, for practice implications, determining the adequacy of specific treatment towards a particular population is an instrumental guideline for clinical practice. Furthermore, practitioners are also advised to examine how clinical and other forms of policies can cater or be applied towards the creation of programs focused on religious and irreligious persons. In the current study, a sample of 414 Christians, non-Christian theists, and non-theist persons from 44 countries assisted in the examination of religious preferences and the moderating variables of sex, race, and national origin in the relationship between religious discrimination and anxiety, along with theoretical expansion. The rapidly changing culture, religious adherence, and religious discrimination anxiety impacts that clients could be experiencing provided ethical incentives and scientific motivation to include such findings into practice. Quarterly psychological practices depend on the ability to provide services that are equally valued and vindicated by research. The increasing demand and interest of pertinence of religious preferences into everyday clinical practice demonstrate the need for conducting and incorporating this type of research. As such, it is hoped that the limitations and strengths of this research effort serve as a source of advocacy, contribution to scholarly development, and social change, and as a stimulant for upcoming research that is much needed for the understanding of human behavior. Next slide, please. I would like to thank all of you again for your help in conducting this project. Are there any questions, comments, or concerns at this time?